And let me make a contrast. You know, negative campaigning is exactly what you don't want to see. But last week, in our local newspaper over here, the Columbine Courier, there was a profile of myself and a profile of Mr. Kaufman. And Mr. Kaufman said, I am a partisan, I'm a conservative, and I'm going to work against the president's agenda, and I am, you know, I'm proud to be the party of no if it means stopping that agenda. And I say the opposite. We need optimism, common ground, and some solutions to the problems we face. And so we have to go out amongst the people that aren't naturally our supporting groups and find out what their concerns are. And I don't see that from him. And I'm not using my words, I'm using his words. That's what I think the whole problem is. And I'll say one more thing about Mr. Kaufman. You know, he has been in the government for 20 years, and I haven't. And I'm proud of the fact that I don't have a political resume. Mr. Kaufman has a long political resume, but I ask conservatives all the time, what is his legacy? What has he accomplished? And I honestly haven't had any conservative come up to me and tell me what he's done. What has he accomplished? So I make that contrast, and I think that's essential to who I am. Thanks for asking that.
What would you do to increase and help small business?
Well, I'll go back to the theme I was just on.
Could you repeat?
Yeah, I'm sorry. What would you do to help small business? A few weeks ago, there was a bill passed through the House, which I would have voted for. It was called 5297. And what it did was, it took $30 billion, a fund. It didn't count again. It doesn't count towards the deficit. It's going to be paid back within 10 years. That fund was to be loaned to small banks, regional banks, banks that have less than $10 billion in assets, and that money is to be loaned to small businesses throughout the communities in the United States. And it's going to be paid back. The banks don't have to loan it to small business, but there's a huge incentive to do so. It's loaned out at about 5%, but if they loan it to small businesses, the percent they pay is as low as 1% on that money. So that's the incentive. You're not hammering over the head to do it, you're incentivizing, which is something the Republicans and all of us would like to see. It's a good idea. Mr. Kaufman said from February of '09, when he first got into office, that his agenda was to support regional banks and small business. And he voted against that bill. And he said on his website, the reason he voted against it is because it added to the federal deficit. That $30 billion fund does not add to the deficit. And it does exactly what, and so that's the contrast I make. When you're willing to vote against your own agenda for power and partisan purposes, I don't know what you stand for anymore. But that's one thing I would do, is here in Colorado we have the business personal property tax. I would eventually work towards phasing that out. Now right now in many communities, that's one of the major supports for school systems, and that's why we haven't been able to phase it out. But deductions for research, tax deductions for research, tax deductions for equipment investment, and right now there's another federal program going on where the federal government is actually subsidizing I think it's about a third of the hourly wage of workers that they hire right now, and the workers have to meet a certain criteria. I think that's a much better program than straight unemployment. Now, we're in dire straits right now, and so unemployment's going to continue. Those benefits have been extended, or they're trying to anyway. So those are at least 4 or 5 things that I would support in terms of supporting small business. You're welcome.
I find it very hard to understand the difference between legal aliens and illegal aliens that our government doesn't seem to know. Legal aliens have to prove to this country that they will become good, productive citizens. And we know who they are, we know their names, and we know their background. sneaking in to this country to do it harm.
Sure.
So I find it very hard to understand why our government doesn't understand that.
Did everybody hear the question? It had to do with immigration. What are we going to do about immigration? Immigration reform needs to be comprehensive, it needs to be federal, and it needs to include three principles. The sovereignty of the United States, which is controlling the border. Rule of law, which means employers and employees follow the rule of law. That's two. And three, the solution has to be humane. And where the common ground is, I think that most all of us who are striving to be in a policy position or are in one, agree that the border has to be secured. Okay, so we've made moves to build a fence along major portions of it. We can't build a fence along the whole border. I've actually patrolled in an F-18 down there with equipment, so I know that, and it wasn't the most efficient way to do it, but I know that electronic monitoring can be effective. So there's going to have to be monitoring the border that way. But it's important to remember that the number of federal agents on our border has doubled in the last 6 years. And the amount of money has almost doubled that's been put into border security. One of the biggest problems we have down there now is a shortage of judges. They are catching people and putting them into holding, and we can't deport them fast enough. That's a side problem. But first of all, the principle, sovereignty of the country, border control, we all agree on that, I think. Rule of law. We have to have a system in place where employers can check the status of their employees and employees. So I think we all agree that that has to be into play. The third thing I said is that the solution has to be humane. Now, some people say that we need to take these 12 million plus people and deport them all. That's the solution. But I haven't heard one conservative or anybody else, anybody, present a plan on how we're going to get 12 million people to come out of the shadows, how we're going to process them, and how we're going to get them out of here. There is no plan to do that. The most conservative advocate of that has no plan. So we have to have a way to get them out of the shadows, deport the people, and I would categorize the people, you were trying to categorize them in some way, and I would categorize the illegal workers here in 3 or 4 ways. Number one, the majority of those workers have Social Security numbers. They may not be legal numbers, but employers aren't hiring workers that don't have Social Security numbers. So the majority of those people are being hired with a number, a false number, and they're paying taxes. The next set of them are people who are essentially working under the table. Of course, we need to eliminate, and there's tons of Americans out there right now, I think, that are working under the table as well. But getting those people out of the shadows is important. But I don't think there's a whole lot of people in this country who just plain aren't working and living off the fat of the land, because there isn't any right now. So I don't think that that's a major portion of this population. They came here for a better life, to work, to earn that money for their families, and in some cases to send that money back to their home country. So we have got to get these people out of the shadows, and there has to be a humane solution to that. We can't rip families apart. It's immoral, it's wrong, and it's not consistent with my beliefs, my moral beliefs, to do that. So there's been some plans presented on how we process all these people, and we have to work out the details of that. But that's essentially where we have to establish some common ground. Go ahead.